going to start the recording now. And all right, so welcome to the first social talk of the combined social and cognition seminar series. And thanks for tuning in despite it being an irregular timing. As a reminder, we typically meet on alternating Fridays at 2 p.m. And so I'm really pleased to introduce today's speaker, Joel Martinez, who's a PhD student at Princeton University, working in the labs of Alex Todorov and Betsy Levy-Pollock. Broadly speaking, their research examines people's idiosyncratic representations of the social world and how these representations reflect the cognitive construction of social identity. So by uncovering the social schemas people use to navigate interpersonal interactions, Joel's research points us towards exciting new methods for understanding social exchange and social movements. So I'd ask you customarily to join me in welcoming Joel to our series, but Zoom applause is inevitably really awkward. So I'll ask you to do something a little less awkward, which is just to clap silently in your heart and make Joel feel very telepathically welcome. All right, Jill, feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much. That was actually a great description of my work. I'm going to use it. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I just want to say this is exciting for me because it's my first external seminar talk. So I hope y'all find something useful or interesting in it. So for today, I'll be discussing my dissertation and some additional collaborative work that are all focused on how immigrants are represented in minds. Okay, so the current political zeitgeist is one of nationalist backlash, which has had a lot of dire consequences for immigrants, especially those who are illegalized or otherwise known as undocumented. And here I'm talking about things like deportation raids, family detention, border deaths, criminalizing propaganda, hate crimes, denaturalization, the list goes on and on and on. But scholars across the disciplines have taken up this issue to help, and I think social cognition researchers have something to contribute also, specifically by assessing the psychology of this backlash and measuring how immigrants are represented in minds. In other words, we can catalog the various understandings of immigrants that exist out there. And you know, out of all the things we could measure or try to tackle, why cognitive representations, they seem so abstract, maybe not useful. But for me, I think the most important thing is that they are a bridge between structural forces and individual political decision and meaning making. And so one obvious example would be how the media frames immigration for people, which then guides how they understand immigrants, which then maybe affects how they vote for immigration policies. But what's interesting is that cognitive representations of immigrants in particular are not often investigated in policy and prejudice research. There's been some notable exceptions, such as Thierry DeVos with his American equals white idea using the IAT. And Susan Fisk and Sapna Sherian have kind of mapped immigrants on the two-dimensional spaces. But it's important to realize there's some limitations that restrict these methods from measuring more complicated mental representations. So typically researchers have to restrict the space of possible exploration by focusing on two groups, two concepts, two dimensions. And so it's interesting to figure out what we'll find if we kind of loosen those restrictions. And so a big component of this talk is to show how recent methodological advances can bring new insights to this kind of question. And so here's a map of the talk. For the first portion, I'm going to be talking about mapping representations using reverse correlation, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And I'll be specifically focused on representations of illegalized immigrants. So we are a politically salient group with very little intergroup contact or visibility. Oftentimes we don't have a wide-reaching voice by which to shape our own image. It's usually shaped for us. And so it's important to try to figure out what images do exist out there. So for study one, I'm going to be focused on how people visualize different documentation statuses. In study two, we're going to look at how people visualize more complicated or intersecting immigrant experiences. And study three will basically ask how shared these representations are. The last portion of the talk is going to be focused on shaping representation. So how do we change them? Specifically looking at the power of immigrant narratives and how they can do the work of shaping these cognitive schemas, trying to connect cognition to more structural forces. And just to let you know, I'm going to be glossing over a lot of technical details and more nuanced analyses, but if you're interested in those, you can ask me about those at the end. All right, so before we get into the studies, it's important to know the method I'm using and why I'm using it. To visualize representations, I'm going to be using reverse correlation. And so this is how it works for those of you who don't know. You start off with a base face. This face is chosen in a way that the features of the face should be able to capture the wide variation that might exist out there of the representations in the world. And so what happens is you superimpose random Gaussian noise over this image, and what you end up with is a bunch of stimuli. And you can see that features of the face get kind of warped based on the light and dark patches of the noise. After this, you just basically put the stimuli into a classification task and ask people, which one looks more like blank, the target that you're interested in. And after the task is done, you basically average out the noise pattern of all the stimuli that they selected, and that becomes the classification image, which is the face that they were ostensibly visualizing. And then from there, you can do further analyses. And so what I really like about this method is, for one, that it's more data driven. So to a larger extent, you're allowing participants to tell you what the relevant dimensions are, right? They'll pop out in the faces. The second reason is that the data output is interpretable and easy to use, right? So you end up with a face, which we see all the time, we can make judgments of. And so there's just a lot of things you can do with this data format. And the last thing is that this method is a bit of a methodological Wild West. So there's still a lot of validation needing to be done in terms of the procedures, but also in terms of the analysis. And so there's a lot of room to explore and to learn from this procedure. All right, so the first study is going to be focused on how people visualize different documentation statuses. For the base face, this is the actual base face that we used, and it is a morph of all the male faces from the London face database. And the reason that we focused on men specifically is because, in case y'all didn't know, deportation is a gendered project. So up to 2012 at least, 85 to 90% of deportations were men. And so we wanted to really focus in on this aspect. All right, so before they did the task, we actually gave them instructions or definitions of the categories, because we didn't want them to be visualizing while also misunderstanding what we were asking them for. So we had 3 conditions. In the undocumented immigrant condition, we told them that they live in the US without legal immigrant status. In the documented immigrant condition, we said they live in the US with legal immigrant status. And in the citizenship or citizen condition, we said that they are born in the United States. And we know that's not true. People can get naturalized. But we wanted people to think about native-born Americans. So the task looks something like this: who looks more like a blank in the United States? And we did this first with Princeton students, specifically because we could do a lot more trials and get better data quality. So we were able to do 770 trials in the lab, which is a lot. Okay, so these are the results. Basically, what you're going to see is the average face in each condition over all the participants. And you can see there's 50 participants in each condition. So this is what Princeton students think US citizens look like. You can see it just looks like a white guy. Here's what they think documented immigrants look like. And here's what they think undocumented immigrants look like. So already these images are worth 1,000 words, right? But we can interrogate them further, and we can ask what dimensions are elicited by these faces. And so we were able to rate them on these 5 dimensions here. But it's important to know that these are averages, right? Not everyone's representations looked exactly like these average images. In fact, here is a random sample within each category, and you can see that there's a lot of heterogeneity there. And so what we did is we got these faces rated too, to make sure that the effects we were getting weren't due to the averaging procedure, but rather are also there when we show all of the heterogeneity that truly exists in each category. Okay, so the first piece of data I'm going to show you is the...
Sorry.
Oh yeah, hi.
Can I ask a question here?
Yeah, go ahead.
So in these questions, what you're asking is a binary question: does it look like a U.S. citizen or not, a documented immigrant or not? Is that right? And it's one face or 2 faces? Sorry,
if we go back. So it's not, sorry, I guess this image is misleading. So basically they only see one of these. Mm-hmm. So they're only doing one of the visualizings, and yeah, there's 2 faces on the screen at the time. So basically, you're saying which one looks more like an undocumented immigrant in the United States, and then they choose between 2 faces.
Right. Okay. And so they never have the option to opt out, in the sense that if they didn't think that either looked like a citizen or non-documented immigrant or a documented immigrant, they didn't have the option to say no to that, so neither, or something like that.
Correct. Yeah.
Can I ask something briefly? Yep. I'm just curious about how you chose those dimensions, just because from the introduction of your talk, you sort of said that, you know, this is a data-driven approach where we're not going to impose a dimensionality. But it seems like by choosing these specific characterizations, even if this isn't how people, you know, were generating these spaces or the dimensions along they were, that you likely would get differences in these dimensions. So I guess, could you speak to how you picked these and what you think participants are doing along these dimensions or other dimensions?
Right. So honestly, these dimensions right here were first picked just simply because, as you'll see, the later part of the project, we had used these dimensions plus a few more to kind of look at immigrant representations. And so I was kind of just borrowing those and placing them here. But I will say that you're right in the sense that this is one of the pieces of the project where you do have to impose some kind of theory in some way, because you need to know what the content is. Of course, we could have done 100 traits or something, but we just didn't have the resources for all that. So this is what we ended up with for now. But I do plan to expand all of it soon. Okay, so the first piece of data I'm going to show you is the racial classification of the average faces here. So on the x-axis, you see the likelihood that each face is from one of the categories on the y-axis. And you can see that the US citizen face was perceived as most likely to just be white, almost 100% likely, and maybe even a little bit Latinx. The documented immigrant face was definitely not white, but maybe a little bit of everything else. And the undocumented face was perceived as definitely not white, a little bit of everything else, and maybe even black, as you can see, over 50% likely to be black. And just so you know, the participants who are doing the ratings were not given the statuses of the faces, so they were just rating based on the image itself. So we could, at least from this, conclude that different documentation statuses are evoking somewhat different racial schemas here. But we can now ask, you know, about the trait information that these faces are also eliciting. And so what I'm showing you here is the ratings of the average composites. So what you can see is that the undocumented face was perceived as more dangerous, less trustworthy, less competent, and less American. The documented face, in some ways, was more alike the citizen face, at least in the first 3 dimensions, but ultimately it was also seen as less American. And these results hold when we look at the ratings of the individual faces too. So overall, you could say that these results show that people represent immigrants in general as non-white, which is just a replication of the American equals white idea. But specifically, undocumented immigrants are racialized as un-American, incompetent, and threatening. And so if we think about, you know, what are the implications of something like this? For those of y'all who don't know who this is Gilmar Ramos Gomez, and he was deported, and he's a US citizen. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna place my data of how people think undocumented immigrants look like right next to him. And I'm gonna let you draw the connection. But as you're drawing this connection, it's also important to keep context in mind, right? So deportations of US citizens have been occurring since the early days of the United States and during progressive administrations like Obama's administration. And so you can imagine how important these images become when it's not just ICE or Border Patrol who are doing the work, but also when citizens get mobilized to also surveil for undocumented immigrants, as ICE is doing with their Citizens Academy courses nowadays. And so this brings up a really crucial question that will lead us into studies 2 and 3. Is this really the face that everybody thinks about when they think of undocumented immigrant, right? Like, is this the exact face? And just to remind you, it's a dark-skinned, threatening, un-American, incompetent face. And so there's 2 ways I went about asking or answering this question. The first is to complicate the identity of this undocumented immigrant, right? So how much does the face change if we give more information about them? And the other way is just to simply keep asking more and more people to think about undocumented immigrants and see if they all share the same kind of face. And so this is going to be studies 2 and 3.
Joel, can I quickly interrupt?
Yep.
A couple of questions to I believe the results, but I have two questions to better understand them. One is, does anything ride on this sort of filter approach or noise approach? So if you gave all these photos to people in the original form and asked them the very same questions, aside from possible social desirability concerns, do you think you would get the same results? So that's one question. And maybe related to that, you didn't say a lot about the sample of pictures, only I think there was some London database or something like that. Can you talk a little more about the distribution of the various either facial expressions, the ethnicities, any other features that eventually come out to separate the groups that people were classifying? Because of course, whatever the input is going to be available for the output. And if there's no input, or the input is differently distributed, it will have an impact on the output.
Right. Can you explain which images you're talking about for the first question? So do you mean the 3 averages, or?
So the original images were averages of a lot of pictures, right? In order to, I guess, capture the original features. Did I understand that correctly? So if you go back to all the way your first slide, just when you introduced the technique where you superimpose the noise.
Oh, I see. Over here. Hold on.
So the starting pictures weren't actually like 700 different people from all kinds of ethnicities and facial expressions and so on.
Right. It's all the same. It's the same base face underneath all these random noises.
So what do you think the impact of that base face is, that it's an average rather than that you have, 700 actual people who get superimposed some noise and then people have to classify?
I get it. Okay, so these are all very good questions because the base face is probably the most important part of this methodology, right? And so this particular base face was a morph of all the men, but it was also a morph of 4 different ethnicities, which varied very greatly in terms of skin color and so on. The facial expressions were pretty neutral, so we weren't getting like smiley or super frowny or anything like that. So yeah, I mean, it is going to affect the kind of representations that we usually end up getting as the output. But I think hold on, let me just go here. I think you can see that there is variation, right? These categories are separating the base face in some ways that are meaningful. In terms of what the difference is between having one base face versus just having a bunch of pictures that you ask people about, that is the direction we're headed. In fact, someone in our lab has been doing work on GAN models and basically using creating and generating realistic looking faces. And so that's going to be the next step for us in terms of reverse correlation and moving away from this noise pattern approach. But this was my early grad school work, so this is what I'm stuck with for now.
Right, and that relates to the first question, whether you would get the same results if you just gave people, original photos and asked them the same questions, and maybe allowed, like Oriel says, an occasional opt-out, or like, I really don't know, this is equally likely. So that would be interesting to me, because there's a way in which people would probably have some representation of the underlying distributions out there in the world. And from those distributions and whatever correlations of display of those photos in newspapers, on TV, and so on, you could possibly derive many of the trait ratings that you have. So as I said, I'm not doubting the results. To me, the question is where these relationships come from, and that's sort of what I'm trying to better understand.
I see. I don't have an answer for that. I don't know where the relationships come from just yet, but this is a direction that I definitely want to go into. And you'll see that there are similar threads as I use different methodologies. So maybe that's helpful for converging evidence.
So Joel, just to jump in here and to take it a little bit further and sort of round out what I was saying before, one of the things that would be interesting, so it's about representations, right? So what are representations? And I guess in some ways, I mean, I love these methods because just as you say, they're data driven, they pull out like any sort of assumptions, you're being agnostic. But on the other hand, if let's say you truly didn't feel like either face felt like a documented immigrant, you still are forced to pick one, right? So then you can, start picking like arbitrarily one face versus the other. If you have an opt-out one, so then in that sense, the representation might speak more to, I'm using a heuristic that, let's say, the media or the news is feeding me, right? So like, I don't personally believe this, but if I have to pick one, and what the world, with the newspapers, how we talk about these things, I guess I'll go with that sort of well documented frame. Sorry for the pun. That type of framework, but it doesn't then speak to what your own necessarily representation is and what it might be, how it might be different than something that you might be regurgitating from the media. So I don't exactly know how to get over that given these methods, although I'd be curious to hear what you thought, because I would assume that having an opt-out button would spoil the effects, kind of like you'd get with the drift diffusion model. You can't really analyze the results anymore. So how can you parse what your own representations are when you're forced to make a decision that might not actually dovetail with what you believe to be true or how you represent something?
Yeah, that's really hard. So you're almost touching on like representation quality and validity kind of questions, right? Possibly one way is to get repeated faces and see if there's consistency in those across time, and maybe hope for the best. I haven't thought about that question before, but I will say that this is a question that I am tackling in terms of other projects. So I have models where I'm disentangling shared versus idiosyncratic judgments of anything, racism, food preferences, celebrities. And in that case, repeated measures become so integral to showing that there is consistency in those judgments in that particular person. So they believe that particular tweet is racist, and they're the only ones who think that way because there's this unique interaction between the two. How to incorporate that into this framework gets a little harder, so I would have to think more about that. Where was I? Okay. All right, so for study 2, we had 16 conditions because we wanted to visualize more complicated identities. So we had people visualize immigrants who were either documented or undocumented. They were from one of these 4 countries: Mexico, China, Nigeria, and Ireland. And we chose these countries specifically because at the time, they were some of the countries with some of the more numbers of undocumented immigrants here in the US. But we also knew that they would be perceived as racially different from each other. And this was important to us because we wanted to disentangle some things. So for example, we could start to test whether an undocumented Mexican would look different than a documented Mexican, for example. And then we also interacted all that with economic circumstance. So the immigrant either had a job or was on welfare. And the reason we added this economic dimension is because immigrants are often theorized or discussed as threatening leeches or job stealers or sympathetic figures who are contributing to the country or in need of help. And so I wanted to see what this dimension would add to these spaces. So this is the instructions, and you can see that I changed it up a bit. This time they're thinking about an individual, so now they have names. So we have Jose Lee Connor Orabaeze, who was born in Mexico, China, Ireland, or Nigeria. He is financially helped through a welfare program or stable through a steady job, and he has been living in the United States with or without legal immigrant status. And that is the exact sentence that they saw as they were doing this classification task. Because this was done on MTurk, we had to reduce the trial numbers by half. All right, so this is the actual results. So these are the averages in the 16 conditions, and there's 30 faces in each condition. And just to orient you, the rows represent different nationalities, and the columns represent the different economic and documentation circumstances. So you could see it goes from like the worst circumstances over here where you're undocumented and on welfare to the best over here where you're documented with a job. And I think the first thing that should pop out at you is that most of the variation is coming from the nationality dimension, right? So the rows look very different from each other. But there's other patterns in here that I'm gonna push your attention towards. So the first pattern is in this 3x3 square. So these are Mexican, Chinese, Nigerian immigrants who have at least one negative thing going on in their life. So they're either, maybe they're documented, but they're on welfare. Maybe they have a job, but they're undocumented. Or maybe they are both undocumented and on welfare. And you can see that there's not a lot of differences within nationality. So those faces don't look very different, which suggests that maybe illegality is not doing anything here. But if we focus on these three immigrants over here who have documentation and a job, you can see that suddenly they're smiling, things are good, that things are looking great. But let's look at what happens with Connor, the Irish immigrant. So we focus on these three conditions, which are conditions where Connor has at least one positive thing going for him. So he might be undocumented, but at least he has a job. You can see that he's pretty either neutral or smiling in some cases. So everything seems to be going okay. But the moment that Connor is both undocumented and on welfare, you can see that suddenly there's this really, really threatening, almost like, how could this be happening to me type of face. And this is actually what we find in the ratings. So we got the same 4 ratings done here. And you can see that incompetent, nothing much is happening. American ratings are mostly driven by the nationality, such that the Irish immigrant is seen as the most American and the Chinese immigrant as the least. But the effects I was talking about really popped out in this dangerous and trustworthiness dimensions. So you can see Connor is in red, the Irish immigrant, and the first 3 tick marks here are conditions where there's at least one positive thing happening. And you can see that Connor stays relatively less dangerous than the other immigrants, as long as one good thing is happening. But the moment that he's both on welfare and undocumented, he gets rated as almost the most dangerous immigrant out of the bunch. But what happens with the Mexican, Chinese, and Nigerian immigrants is that they stay relatively neutral in terms of danger, as long as one negative thing is happening to them, if not 2. But they become almost as undangerous as Connor when they both have a job and are documented. So you could see that there's some double standards at play, right? When there's at least one good circumstance, the Irish immigrant is given the benefit of the doubt, whereas the other immigrants are expected to have at least one negative thing happening in their life. But there's also some expectation violations. So you can see that this effect over here where Connor has all these negative things happening, it's almost like a black sheep effect, right? Unexpected. Whereas the other immigrants are only redeemed when they are high achieving or excellent. And so the results show that when we start manipulating race and nationality and economic circumstance of this undocumented immigrant, representations are now racialized in a different way, such that they're coding the social positions these immigrants are expected to have based on their nationality or race. And so when we think about this question, is this really the face everyone thinks about? We know that this face changes when you add nationality into the mix. But illegality itself continues to be racialized, not by skin color. So it's not like the undocumented Mexican was darker than the documented Mexican, but it's because of the way that these immigrants are expected to have different social positions in life based on their white or non-white status, or even European, non-European. All right. So the other way we could answer the same question of is this really the face everyone has in mind is just to keep asking more and more people and seeing if everyone shares this representation. And so for this study, I'm going to be literally mapping by geography. So I focused on participants from California and Texas. Specifically, these are border states with very different political institutions that are for or against immigrants to some extent, and also have considerable within state variation in both immigrant sentiment and immigrant presence. And so we thought it'd be interesting to see how representations might be patterned by geography. Within each state, we had people think about either illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants. The idea here was to look at framing effects. So there's a literature out here that is saying that the way that we label groups has consequences for the type of attitudes we have towards them or the policy preferences that we prefer. And so the question here is do people actually visualize this distinction, right? Do they think of someone different when they're given 2 different labels for the same thing? And so we collected over 1,000 faces here, so about 250 in each condition. And we collected a lot of individual difference measures just to see if there's any clusterings by them. I won't be talking about those today, but just know that they are there and I am analyzing them. And lastly, this is just a map of where our participants came from. So you can see that most of them in Texas, at least, came from Houston, Austin, San Antonio, Brownsville, and Dallas areas. And you could see that in the California sample, it was mostly Bay Area and San Diego. area. All right, we use the same base face, but I'm just going to jump into the results. So this is how Californians think about illegal versus undocumented immigrants. And here's how Texans think about illegal versus undocumented immigrants. And so what you can see is that there's not much difference. In fact, there's not much difference between them and between the face from study one with the Princeton students. And so we might conclude that maybe the label or state doesn't matter, but this doesn't really jive with how we think about the influence of our environments on our thinking. And so I looked at other ways of looking at the data. So conservatism versus liberals, et cetera, and the same face kept popping up. And so one might, I guess, conclude that I guess this is the face that everyone thinks about. But I have access to all of the individual faces, and there's a lot of heterogeneity in there, which suggests to me that maybe there's something about this averaging procedure that is hiding idiosyncrasies. One way to get at those idiosyncrasies is to get all of the faces rated and look at differences, but that can be very costly, and oftentimes the individual faces, depending on the category you're interested in, don't always have enough signal in them, so they need a little bit more noise averaging. So we needed a kind of middle ground, right, between the individual faces and all of these like super averaged faces over here. And that's when I realized that these images are just pixels, which means we can treat them like MRI images, which means I looked into machine learning approaches. So that's when I came up with this pipeline for mapping shared representation, specifically of faces. So the first step is obviously to compute the representations. So if you remember the procedure, you have the base face, the noise pattern, together they become the composite image. But what's important here is that the base face only really helps us visualize the noise. So the noise itself is the representation, at least as how I'm thinking about it. It's the representation that people decided on through all their choices. So what you do is you take that noise pattern, you turn it into a vector, and then you can compute the correlations between everybody's representations, right? So now you have a similarity matrix that tells you the similarity between everyone. From there, you can then look for clusterings, right? So there's a lot of clustering algorithms you could use. I decided on hierarchical clustering, as you'll see for why in a little bit. But obviously there's a lot of algorithms and cluster metrics and blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of things to mess with in these kinds of approaches. And I am messing with those and seeing how they affect the results, but I'm not gonna be going over that now. The point here is just to say that you can find clusters. And once you have those clusters, you could look at the average face for each clusters just to see how people are representing the different clusters. Or sorry, how the different clusters are representing immigrants. And of course, we need to validate this, right? Because you can throw trash into an algorithm and it'll spit out whatever you want, or whatever it wants. And so what I thought about was two ways of validating that made sense for this question. So the first one is to try to predict the cluster membership of the clusters from the individual differences. So maybe conservatives provide this kind of face more or so on. And so I'm not going to be going over that data today, but I'm using things like random forests and decision trees to look at that. But what I will be showing you today is getting those average faces rated and seeing how the content differs between clusters. And then of course, at the end of everything, you could look and see if the full story kind of makes sense together. All right, so this is the actual data. So these are the clusterings, and you can see on the x-axis, this is a dendrogram. So on the x-axis is all of the faces, the 1,002 faces. And as you move up vertically, the faces start getting clustered. And the further apart they get clustered, the kind of more dissimilar they are. And the closer down they get clustered, the more similar they are. And so what you can do is then there's all these metrics to figure out what's the optimal cluster size and so on. But we decided to instead look at a range of clusters. So we chose 5, 10, and 15. And so the question is, do we get meaningful differences as you move down this hierarchy, or is information maintained as you go down these into these smaller clusters? And so this is the actual faces of the 5 cluster solution. What you can see is that I've color coded them, so you can see which one goes with which. And the number at the bottom of the face just represents how many people ended up in that cluster. So you can see that face 1 or cluster 1 had 382, had the most number of people, whereas cluster 5 had the least number of people. And you can see that as we go down into smaller and smaller clusters, that some of the faces start to get partitioned out. So phase 2, for example, becomes phase 2, 4, and 10. I've color coded them. And phase 1, for example, becomes phase 1, 6, 8, and 9. And as you break it down more, these faces start to partition more and more and more into more specific faces. And so the question is, what are we learning as we partition or as we combine representations? And this is something that the trait ratings can start to get at. So what you're seeing here at the bottom left corner over here is the grand average face. So basically this is taking the full sample and just taking the average face. And so I got all of these faces rated on American, dangerous, and dominant. And I also got them racially classified. So what you're gonna see is the top 2 racial classifications in the bottom corner here. What you'll see is that this grand average is seen as a little American, a little dangerous, and a little dominant. And it's seen as Black by 82% of the participants who did the ratings. And the question becomes, how do these ratings change as you partition this face out into smaller and smaller clusters? So here's the 5 cluster solution. And you can see that cluster 1 basically looks like the grand average, which is maybe not that surprising given that it's the largest cluster, and so maybe weighs in more towards the grand average, or weighs in the most on the grand average. Cluster 2 has instead a lighter skinned face. It's perceived as Latinx more so. It's also rated as very American and not dangerous. Cluster 3 is a dominant face that's perceived as Black, but also a little bit Asian. Cluster 4 is a little American and dominant and Black. And cluster 5 is a little bit of everything and also Black. And so, what happens once we start breaking these faces down? So here's the 10 cluster solution. And you can see that some aspects remain the same. So if we focus on phase 2 over here in green, phase 2 became phase 2, 4, and 10. And you can see that no matter what the partition was, the face rating stayed pretty consistent. American and not dangerous, American, not dangerous, American, not dangerous. But other faces created a different pattern. So for example, if we focus on phase 1, which is in pinkish red, you can see phase 1 became 1, 6, 8, and 9, and not all of these faces shared the same rating pattern. So the phase 1 typically had this kind of upward linear trend, but phase 6, 8, and 9 tended to have this more American, not dangerous trend, which maybe you could see from the smiliness of some of these faces, which we would have never figured out if we had stuck to the overall average. And as we break it down more, some of the things stay the same, but there's new emerging properties. So some of the faces get so specific that, for example, if we focus in phase 12 over here, we're seeing for the first time a large proportion of people are using the Middle Eastern racial classification. And so, all of these faces are supposed to represent the same category, right? And so maybe it's instructive to look at the overall distribution of racial classification. So most of the people saw these faces as Black, and then Latinx, and then white, and then Asian, and then Middle Eastern. And you might be thinking like, well, this doesn't match the demographics of what I think the undocumented immigrant demographic is. And so how I'm interpreting that is, to the extent that someone is thinking of a Mexican, for example, they're definitely not thinking of a lighter skinned one. They're thinking of a darker skinned one. And so this is really showing the role of colorism and illegality. And so overall, we can see that this particular face that we keep seeing over and over and over is widely shared, right? It tends to be the largest cluster, but there are meaningful pockets of people who are thinking of someone different. And who those people are, I'm still figuring out, but just to give you some preliminary results, phase 2 here tends to be visualized more by Californians and by people who perceive there to be more undocumented immigrants in their neighborhoods. And phase 5 over here tends to be visualized a little bit more by Texans and by conservatives. All right, so to conclude the portion on mapping representations, I have shown you that illegality evokes threatening racialized imagery. When you start to manipulate the nationality, economic status, we still find racialization, but this time in expectations about the social positions they're expected to have. And then finally, this imagery is widely shared, but it's not completely shared. Not everyone hates undocumented immigrants. And, but it is worrying that a larger proportion do have this representation in mind. And so I'll give deeper thoughts about these patterns at the end of the talk.
Can I briefly interject?
Yep.
Really, really interesting to see all those clusters. One thought that I've been having, I'm not a face, I don't analyze faces, but I was just wondering, is it possible with this technique to apply some of the models that Alex has developed regarding judgments of these different face dimensions and apply those algorithms to these faces? It's not the same as human raters, but it can still give you some sort of ratings on these different dimensions. Is that possible with this technique or no?
It's a little harder because that technique depends on the facial features, right? Having a computerized model of all of the different points on the face and how they relate to the judgments themselves. So with this noise pattern being random and so on, it's hard to make that distinction. But the GAN model project that I was talking about earlier, where they are generating random faces that look very hyper realistic, like you would think like these are actual people. They are trying to rein in the space from that model and do the same thing. So trying to find the dimensions to make sure that they can now generate random faces, hyper-realistic faces that are trustworthy or dominant or whatever the case. So it is headed in that direction, but I don't think you can do it with this kind of noisy face.
Thanks.
All right. So the last portion is about how we might come to change these representations. So we're all pretty familiar with Trump's contribution to these nationalist backlash, but it's really important to know that these characterizations are false, right? There's no or a small negative relationship between immigrants and crime rates. But this hasn't stopped these characterizations from being codified into federal policy. So in 2017, Trump signed an executive order that basically told ICE to publish a weekly list of crimes committed by immigrants. And I actually have those lists. They might still be online. But if you go page by page, it basically has literal lists of crimes and the national origins of the immigrants who committed them. And so, this really led us to wonder, how are these propaganda narratives, are they meaningfully impacting individual beliefs about immigration and immigrants? And there's a lot of reasons to believe they do, right? So we tend to learn from, attend to, and remember negative information more than positive or neutral. And this kind of bias can be compounded by overestimating the believability and probability of accessible events. And so when these characterizations are broadcast to the media, they start to shape people's perceptions of how shared these representations are, right? So they start to constitute common knowledge. And we know that perceptions of shared view, especially those that are codified in federal policy, they matter because they start to shape people's policy preferences and beliefs about what is moral treatment of immigrants. But this pipeline also suggests that maybe this criminal narrative could be combated by these by positive counterexemplars. And in fact, this is something that we tried back in 2017. On Twitter and Facebook, we asked people to share their immigrant excellence stories. So it's a hashtag, it's probably still around. But people contributed and they were all discussing like achievements and struggles. It was really beautiful. But it's an open question whether these narratives and counter narratives are impacting representations, and also what are the consequences of them. And before I go further, I just want to make a note that both public and scholarly discourse has highlighted the fact that not all immigrants are treated equally. There's a lot of dimensions upon which immigrant groups differ, but one very salient one is race. And one reason that racialization may be such a common practice is that people have a lay theory that it's predictive of other dimensions, how dangerous this group is, how industrious this group is. And we know this is bad because it bifurcates immigrants, and that has a lot of consequences. And so we were thinking that insofar as someone's going to be endorsing this kind of racialization, it should really be moderated by some perceiver ideology, right? And so we thought one excellent candidate would be system justification, which is the endorsement or defense of the status quo. We thought this should moderate narrative impact, specifically because it leads to motivated processing and stereotyping that typically defends the legitimacy of the system. And this is especially the case under threat, which is what criminal narratives do. And so the guiding questions for this project were, do different narratives impact representations of immigrants? Does learning about these negative and positive exemplars, do does reading about these individuals, does that impact how we think about the groups that they belong to? And finally, do these narratives influence policy preferences? So this was our approach. In 2017, we ran the first experiment, and in 2018, we ran the pre-registered replication and extension. We collected over 1,000 US residents from MTurk who provided trait ratings of immigrant groups. So these were Germans, Russians, Mexicans, and Syrians. We chose these groups because they were politically salient at the time of the project. And they also provided trait ratings of individuals from those groups that were associated with either a criminal achievement or a struggle narrative. And the way that we decided to measure representations here is to take from representational similarity analyses. And so, for example, here we have Hans from Germany and Nikolai from Russia, and they've been rated on 7 dimensions related to social cognition and to immigrant discourse. And what we did is decided to treat these trait ratings as the vector that represents Nikolai and the vector that represents Hans. And so what we did is we took a correlation, and that became the similarity between those 2 immigrants. And we put that into a similarity matrix, which had all of the similarities between all the immigrants. From these matrices, we could then extract the latent cognitive representation of how people are organizing them. So this is what the tasks look like. So the first thing that they did was rate the nationality groups 1 by 1 and trait by trait. The next thing they did was rate the individual immigrants. So here we have Abdallah from Syria. He conducts research on brain dysfunction to help find treatments. And so they would do all the ratings 1 by 1, immigrant by immigrant. And in the replication, we actually had a second round of nationality ratings. So the idea here is, do the representations of the groups change from before to after reading about individual immigrants from those groups? And we finished off with, of course, the system justification scale and policy questions, which I'll talk about later. So you saw an achievement narrative. Here's one that could be that they could have seen in the struggle condition. So Abdallah might have been a peasant farmer in a rural area of his home country, but he now farms in the US for little pay and long hours. In the criminal condition, Abdallah might have been arrested in 3 countries for selling all types of drugs. And so just to note, the achievement narratives came from the immigrant excellence hashtag. Not exactly the same stories, but definitely modeled after them. The struggle narratives came from just thinking of struggles that immigrants face when they come here. And the criminal narratives actually came from the lists that Trump was putting out. All right, so we're gonna jump into the results. So this is before they read any narratives. The question is, how are people organizing the immigrant groups at baseline? And so you can see here that Syrians are clustered with Mexicans and Russians with Germans in experiment 1 and in the replication the next year. So this suggests that pre any narratives, people are already racializing immigrants. And we can talk afterwards why I'm thinking about it as race or racialization. Now we can ask, how are they thinking about the individual immigrants who are embedded in all these narratives? So what I'm showing you here is a multi-dimensional scaling plot. So each immigrant is represented by a point and the first letter of their country. And the closer they are in this space, the more similar their representations were. The more far apart, the more different. And hopefully what's jumping out at you is that the immigrants and the achievement narratives are all clustered together. They're all one big lump in the middle. But the immigrants in the crime and struggle conditions, so those in blue and red, they tended to be more differentiated from each other. And if we actually drew an imaginary line somewhere around here, you might notice that all the Germans and Russians tended to be on one side of the space, and all the Mexicans and Syrians tended to be on the other side of the space. But we need a way to quantify this, right? Not just look at this map. And so that's actually what we did. So over here, what you're gonna see on the x-axis is a different narrative, so achievement, crime, and struggle. And on the y-axis is the average similarity between all of the immigrants in those similarity matrices. And so you could see in the achievement condition, the immigrants were almost perfectly correlated. So the correlation was around a 0.92. Whereas immigrants in the struggle condition were a little more differentiated, and immigrants in the criminal condition were the most differentiated. And this occurred also in the replication the next year. And importantly, the size of the space was moderated by the ideology of the person. So specifically, we focus on this right-hand side. These are people who are high system justifiers. And you could see that they just tend to differentiate immigrants more than those who are on the other side of the scale. But importantly, they are not completely resistant to these achievement narratives. You could see they're a little bit more homogenized than the other two in both experiments. But the thing that scares us, and there's something unique and special about these criminal narratives. So if we focus on the red line, you could see that it's pretty flat for both experiments, which suggests that these criminal narratives are making the most egalitarian in our sample look like the least egalitarian. So they all have very differentiated immigrant representations. And so it's important to figure out what that organization is, right? And one way we thought that they would be organized is by race. And so we created this a priori hypothesis matrix. Basically, what it says is Germans and Russians are similar to each other. Mexicans and Syrians are similar to each other, but those two groups are different from each other. And the question is how well the empirical data matches this a priori matrix. And so you could see here that in the crime and in the struggle conditions, that it matches pretty well. They're pretty correlated. And so this suggests that criminal and struggle narratives are not only differentiating immigrants, they're also racializing them or keeping the racial structure there. Whereas the achievement narratives, you can see the correlation is around 0. So basically, not only are achievement narratives homogenizing immigrants, but they're also de-racializing them to some extent. We had a question about generalization. So what you think about these individuals, does it impact how you think about the groups? And so the first thing we examined was how similar each immigrant was to its respective group before and after reading the narratives. And that's what this data shows here. So you can see that after the narratives, the groups became more similar to the individual immigrant representations. So there was a linking going on between the individuals and the groups. And this linking actually had consequences for the relationships between the groups themselves. So that's what this data shows here. You can see that in the achievement condition, the groups became a lot more similar to each other. But in the crime and in the struggle conditions, the groups stayed as differentiated as before the narratives. And so what we can conclude here is that after exposure to these narratives, the group representations were updated in a way that incorporated information about how those individuals were related to each other. And then it just kind of took on that map. So there is a generalization that is occurring. All right, the last thing I want to talk about here is do these representations matter, or are we simply crunching fancy numbers? And so that's where the policy questions come in, right? And so you can see here that the achievement condition led to more pro-immigrant policy preferences. So the question here was, should limits on immigration and access to resources increase or decrease? But importantly, this was also related to the size of the representational space. So you can see in the achievement and struggle conditions in green and blue, the more homogenized the immigrants were in their minds, the more pro-immigrant their policy preferences. So this suggests that the way that immigrants are structured in mind are politically consequential in some way, but we need to validate that link. There's a lot more work that needs to be done there. All right, so to conclude this particular last part on shaping representations, we have learned that criminality differentiates immigrants based on a widely available racial schema. So that schema was already there at baseline. They were organized in a very particular way. But achievement narratives do homogenize them and deracialize them. And how we're thinking about this effect is an in-group incorporation. So they're becoming American, so to speak. We also learned that there was some generalization. So the way that the individual immigrants were related to each other became how the groups were related to each other. And we believe that this happened because of the trial by trial task structure. They were rating each thing one by one. And you can imagine the memory reactivation and integration that is happening in such a task. So probably linking everything together. We also learned that ideology shapes the impact of these narratives. So just because you're egalitarian doesn't buffer you against the criminal narrative. And just because you're non-egalitarian doesn't mean you're going to be resistant to these achievement narratives. But before you go throwing achievement narratives at everyone, I want to caution us. They can be very objectifying. So typically they place the value of an immigrant on what they can contribute to the country. They also bolster bootstrap mythology. So just because these immigrants were able to do it, anyone should. And they also bolster model minority. So we have seen this already in the DACA and Dreamer discourse, such that those who have DACA status or Dreamer status are perceived as more deserving than those who were not eligible. All right, to summarize everything, I really hope that these projects put social cognition in more direct conversation with critical theorizing. Although there was different projects and methods and groups that I was looking at, they captured the same outcomes of a racist empire building. And we know that race is a powerful illusion wielded to manufacture oppressive double standards, and the state participates in this kind of racialization using different technologies. And these technologies produce and mobilize racial classification schemas that we then incorporate into our cognition. And so what my projects are really doing is saying these technologies are doing their job. Illegality in mind just has no independent existence from a racial anchor. And so this brings up questions of whether illegalization and racialization and these processes are the same, are they different, in what ways? But there is some good news. I have shown that these processes can be resisted to some extent and counter-mobilized, but not all strategies are ideal, right? So we learned that the achievement framings can help at the level of cognition, but they can be weaponized socially. Also, there's been a push to call us undocumented rather than illegal. And I've shown that people visualize the racialized threat either way, suggesting that maybe we need to move away from that dichotomy towards more effective language, which is why I've started using illegalized. But overall, I hope that these studies warn us to be careful, but also a little bit more radical and out of the box in the counter strategies we employ. It's important to know when they're effective and when they can backfire. So I want to thank everyone here for listening, my collaborators, the funding, and if you want to keep in touch, there's my information at the bottom. Thank you.
Great, so we have basically time allotted to 1:30 for any sort of questions, or like if you're interested in maybe some of the technical details or things that Joel alluded to but didn't have a chance to address in the presentation. This is the space for that. If you have to hop off because it's the now 1 o'clock, thanks for joining us. And I guess, yeah, we'll just start the Q&A now.
Can I ask a question? I don't know how we're doing this. Is somebody keeping his sack? This was a fascinating talk, and I'm thinking about this in terms of my type of work, which is more based on social media text data. And I've been thinking a lot about the difference between generic statements versus specific statements. You know, if somebody says this gay person is disgusting, that has very different connotations for attitudes than saying gay people are disgusting, right? So I was wondering, what do you see as the connection between that framing and this framing? Because especially in that last study, I saw that you were highlighting the effect of an individual narrative on the group representation, but in the earlier studies, it seemed like the individual and the group were kind of more amorphous, maybe. So I was wondering what you think about the effect of generality as a kind of dimension on your results.
Yeah, well, very interesting. The previous studies were maybe a little more amorphous because I'm trying to get a visual understanding of the categories, which, like not everyone's going to have a very clear representation in mind, which maybe gets at Oriel's point. And so maybe that's why it's amorphous there. I mean, I imagine if you had very clear categories that everyone kind of knew what it looked like, then maybe it wouldn't be so amorphous, the individual versus the group. And so I think what that means is that whatever visual stereotypes exist at the collective level might not be uptaken by everyone at the individual level. In terms of here, I'm dealing more with concepts, I guess, semantic traits and words and stuff like that. And so maybe that's why we're able to kind of see the way that they're connected together in a better way, because maybe the measurements are better. But that's just like my guess. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, someone else I think has a question.
Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, hi Joel. Thank you for the talk. I had a question about the last graph you showed, in which you presented the correlation between like inter-immigrant similarity. Yeah, that's the graph. So I was wondering, how did you calculate this inter-immigrant similarity for each participant?
Oh, right. So hold on, let me go to here. So let's pretend this is one participant's data, all right? So here we have Hans and Nikolai, and they rated these immigrants in all these dimensions. So what we did is we correlated this vector of trait ratings with this vector of trait ratings, and that became the similarity here, right? So let's pretend this is Hans and Nikolai. And so what that x-axis similarity value is taking this upper triangle and taking the average of it.
Okay. Yeah, great. I was thinking that this is what you were doing, but I didn't know, so it's better to ask. And then I have a more general comment, which is, you just said before answering to Babak that one thing you think you are capturing is semantic representations, but I mean, do you have any thoughts about the fact that the semantic representation seems to be quite flexible to your manipulation, and whether that, I mean, so the fact that you can manipulate so easily with a narrative, how you represent a concept, let's say, well,
okay, so I don't want to say that it's an enduring change,
okay,
because that's not something I tested. So I don't know how long this effect lasts or anything like that. But I will say that. Oh wow, I just blinked. I'm sorry. Could you?
No, it's fine. Look, I was thinking about the more general. It's a more theoretical question, which is, whether semantic representations are like some more or less permanent, or whether they are contextual dependent. And I would say that your data suggests the second rather than the first.
Right, we were surprised. We were surprised because we thought that these immigrants would be subtyped. That's what I thought was going to happen, is like, these are going to be achieving immigrants and they're going to be very different than the group representations. But that's why I highlighted maybe the fact that the way that they were learning the information was randomized, and it was like they would see Hans and rate sociability, and then they would see someone else and then rate something else. And so the fact that everything was randomized probably linked everyone in some way together. So I think there's something to explore there about task structure and how representations get modified.
Okay, and
can I just add, that's one thing that I actually wanted to ask. So that's what I didn't understand about this generalization comment when you're talking about the relational structure. So just because things are randomized, what does that do to the relational structure? Can you say that again? Yeah,
so I'm coming from, well, I started out in Ali Preston's lab. She does work on memory integration. And so they had a paper in 2015, I believe, looking at how blocked learning versus interleaved learning affects memory integration processes. And so I'm thinking of this particular task as a form of the interleaved learning, where all of the information is being learned and weaved in together. And so all of those informations then become kind of linked compared to like a blocked learning where you might have rated all of the Germans first, and then all of the Syrians, and then all of the Mexicans or something like that.
But so then is what your argument that an interleaved or randomized order moves it into a gestalt representation versus a more nuanced, like, what, I mean, what's the, I guess, the higher order implication of the randomized trial structure?
Well, I haven't gone that deep into it, but you can imagine that maybe there's a group representation. There's now the representation of the individual, and those are just becoming closer. And because the individuals are also close to the other individuals, they're all kind of like getting closer. And so whatever structures are available between the individuals kind of get linked up to the group level. That's how I'm thinking about it. But if you have a different idea, I would love to hear it.
Well, let's talk when we chat. Yeah.
Okay.
I have two follow-ups to Mark's. One is, I guess, a second clarification on that inter-immigrant similarity.
Okay.
If they're just correlations, I guess I didn't understand how they're greater than one.
Right.
Yeah.
So where is it? Here. Those are Fisher-C transformed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the second question actually refers to one of the slides where you have the multidimensional scaling.
This one.
So, yes. It's a very interesting structure, actually, how like circular it is. But, you know, I guess, do you have any comments on essentially, well, one, I'm curious, I'm not sure if you have this information offhand, but how many dimensions the multidimensional scaling revealed. And, you know, so for example, you pointed out that the x-axis here, it seems to be something like that race dimension, right? Where you have these individuals on the left are, you know, I forget what the R and the G is, German and Russian.
German, Russian.
Yeah, and so do you have any insights into the y-axis and together how much variance both of those explain?
I removed the axes because I had no idea what they were doing. But I will say that this plot is maybe a little deceiving if you're gonna dive super deep into it, because the achievement immigrants were all plotted as one plot. The struggles immigrants were plotted as another plot, and the crime as another plot, and they were overlaid over each other using a Procustes rotation to make sure all the immigrants were kind of aligned across those three maps. So you're not necessarily seeing like a true dimensional space. It's more just like how clustered are these immigrants within a narrative condition.
I see. Because if you did it across all the groups, presumably this narrative would become one of the dimensions by which you separate the immigrants.
Right. And one of the things that made it hard was that simply the average similarity was different. So the scales were very off. You had to like normalize them somehow, which is why I took this approach.
Okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I was just, I guess I was just curious as to, you know, this seems to be another way of tackling what the representations are. And, you know, people have brought up maybe this is shaped by the task design or the types of stimuli you're using. But yeah, I was just interested in essentially, you know, do you believe there are underlying dimensions on which immigrants are represented, or is it, you know, is this something that people construct on the fly for your experiment, and maybe in the real world they don't have these dimensions, but they have these space dimensions, and maybe there are clusterings? I guess just, you know, I know it's a vague question, but do you believe there are underlying dimensions of the way people represent immigration, or is it something more general in regards to people representing others?
I'm never one to say anything I'm studying is universal. So I'll start there. I think that it goes back to like the environments that we're in. And I think that it has a lot to do with the institutions that we are living under. But if we lived in very different institutions, we might get a different pattern. I'm not sure. But that's something I definitely want to look into, maybe with cross-cultural collaborations.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, so I think if there are no further questions, or like you think of something later, maybe you can shoot Jewel an email if you have something to follow up on. Otherwise, I think we can put this session to a close. Thank Joel again for this really, really cool work and for presenting and sharing their research. Yeah, let's see.